All right, I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. So I'm going to show you a lot of slides. I'm going to try to not be too slow about it because there are quite a number. And I did have this idea before I put this show together of starting off with not this slide, but with a drawing that represents kind of the trajectory of my life as I see it, which is kind of more like this. But in a slide format, you kind of have to show it like this. So I'm starting off with a little bit of background about where I come from, because I think it is particular to each of us what shapes us as we're growing. So I grew up in a house with full of art, and my father, Gary, was a painter, and this is actually a painting of him painting by a painter who was another kind of influence in my life. My father was a printmaking professor at Smith College, and he transformed his work repeatedly over his lifetime. But for me, the thing that really launched my relationship with my father as kind of a person who I was on a trajectory with in art making was when he moved from printmaking to painting at about the same moment that I did as a teenager. So here's one of his paintings. We spent years drawing and painting together and sitting at dinner kind of thinking about what we had done and sort of practicing actually the form of the critique, which I didn't realize I was doing as a kid until at some point as a professor, another professor said, "When did you learn to critique?" And I was like, "Oh, I learned as a child," which is funny. But I also happened to grow up in this really kind of wonderful space of the Pioneer Valley in Western Massachusetts, where there were an amazing just wealth of artists. There still are. And so Stanley Lewis was one of my father's really dear friends, who's a pretty well-known painter and a crazy person, hilarious. Installing a show with Stanley was like one of the joys of my life because his installation technique is like there, which is kind of how he lives his life. And Katie Schneider, who makes these like exquisite little miniature paintings, and her husband, Dave Gloman, whose plein air paintings, like really luminous and beautiful. And one of the things that I started to realize, like as I was growing up was, and maybe more with the perspective of some distance, is that each of these people was very much centering their art making right in the middle of their lives, which I think for me was really important and influential. Their work wasn't about being glib and glitzy. It was really about kind of, I don't know, being very centered, with the exception of John Gibson, who, if you've seen his paintings, like his entire life, he just paints balls. But anyway, that's, he was another one of those Northampton painters. And they're actually imagined. He has a little quote that I read recently where somebody gave him a real ball and he tried to paint it and he was like, it's not nearly as good. It's much better to imagine them. So for me, my jumping off place into this kind of milieu of art making was really this process of realizing that I was so intrigued by the natural world and I wanted to kind of use my drawing as a way of learning to see the world. So I think this might be my first oil painting. Not that it's the greatest, but I just feel like, for context, like, I don't know, I was a pretty weird kid. I thought it was a great time to go stand in a really cold field in November when it's probably raining and learn how to paint with oils. I do wonder. And so I loved my woods. I loved kind of these interior, exterior spaces. So little bit older. These are tiny actually, so it's kind of strange to see them blown up like that, but these little studies. And I was doing this all through high school, pretty independently, because my art teacher in high school was absolutely terrible, but my father was pretty good. So he came in and taught my art classes sometimes in my high school because my teacher was so bad. And then after high school, I spent a year in Portugal. So I had graduated from high school, and the program that I went on was AFS. So it was meant to be you're back in high school, and I was pretty bored. I loved the challenge of trying to figure out how to be in high school in Portuguese, because I'd not had any Portuguese. But I would regularly just play hooky and go and draw, because again, back to that, like trying to understand the world that I'm living in just by looking. And I was really shy. That's the other thing. I feel like that was a key component to why this happened, is like talking to people, no, but drawing them, yes. So after Portugal, I came back. I went to Wesleyan for college, and I continued to have this real interest in the painting studio, but the painting teacher and I really did not see eye to eye. So I was kind of conflicted between painting and ceramics, and the ceramics people were really fun. So I just hung out in the ceramic studio, but I also kind of started into this like exploration of the three-dimensional form, and I did a ton of life drawing. This was actually my teammate. I rode crew and I ran cross country and track, and my teammate from the crew team, Alyssa, became my model for my senior thesis show. So I did a ton of life drawing, and then thinking about sort of this question, like I made these huge pots. They're thrown and coiled, and then with these arms and hands emerging, which I think were partially influenced by that, like seeing a lot of architecture in Europe during that year away, but also thinking about like this question of emergence, which I think feels so much like a question that might, I don't know, it makes sense for a kid in college. During that, my senior year, my painting professor told me that if I ever wanted to make anything of myself, I'd have to learn to separate myself from my father, which was a kind of a funny thing for her to say, right? Because like I'm off in the ceramic studio making a lot of things, but I think what it did for me that was pretty interesting was that it kind of started to draw a line. It made me sort of stop and think. And I guess I'm curious about whether you guys are, a lot of you are in college right now, right? Are there people asking you those questions? This was not a question that I liked. This was a question that I've thought a lot about, though. Like for me, it was a kind of a turning point, because I did not turn away from my father's influence. I actually found that I really, that like being centered in my family was super important to me. And I think it kind of circled back into making much more functional work later. I eventually went to graduate school in ceramics, and in the my graduate program, I sort of split my time between making tons of work in clay, but also really pursuing a lot more drawing, and then ending up in the printmaking studio. And I think one of the things that for me became clear at that moment in time was that I was very drawn to process. And so I wanted, I wanted gesture, and I wanted color, and I wanted all of these like formal aspects to the work that I was making. But I also really loved, in both the printmaking and ceramics, I loved that moment when you kind of step aside from the control in a certain way in both of these media. Unlike in drawing, right there, your hand is right there the whole time. You don't ever, you can keep drawing actually forever. But with the printmaking, these are, so I was taking the drawing you just saw and turning it into these like very, very large prints. They're like, I guess, 4 by 6 feet, and monoprints. And I think there's a sort of magic that happens right when you kind of let go of that control and like it's in the press and you don't know what's going to happen, and then you pull it out. And I think that for me was like really analogous from between the printmaking and the ceramics, that kind of moment of letting go of control and letting something happen that's kind of bigger than you. I think it's also when I started to discover that I really was interested in understanding the chemistry behind the work that I was making. So I started making these really crazy gestural figures, these monkeys. I basically thought, like, what is the most gestural animal that I can make? And I want them to be kind of in our space, not, they're shown on a pedestal, but for me it was like I really wanted them to occupy space with the viewer, and I wanted to think about how, like, making these kind of very large attenuated forms out of slabs, and then really trying to express the gesture that I saw in those creatures. There's I made a lot of monkeys. I spent a lot of years going to places where you can see monkeys, which are zoos, and they're depressing places. They were also kind of amazing places because when you sit and watch something that is as intelligent as a monkey or an ape, like, they interact with you as you're drawing, which is kind of amazing. These pieces are, most of them were atmospheric fired first, and then like, I loved the soda kiln, and then I would step it down and refire to add more color. So that first one with a really red face, that one got down to like really low temperature. That's a chrome and lead glaze. I would not use that at this point, but so I kept drawing. I kept thinking about that amazing interaction that I was experiencing with these creatures, and thinking about like how thin that line is between them and us, and what it is that's making it okay for us to keep them in these spaces where they're clearly bored out of their minds. But they came and sat and like watched me draw, which is really cool. And eventually I just couldn't I couldn't do it anymore. So I kind of moved away from the monkey, but it did take a while because I thought there was a lot there, and I loved that sort of play back and forth between human and animal. And the last thing I wanted to say about this work is that one of the things I discovered was this interesting way that the slabs could kind of become a drawing on the surface of the pieces. So I was thinking a lot as I was putting these forms together about the way that the lines intersected, and like adding them when I wanted them or removing them, but trying to kind of keep that gesture going. There were some other creatures along the way. There's guinea fowl, who are just so crazy. They seem kind of comical. They have these masks, don't seem real. I had a flamingo period. That one I can't really explain. There's another guinea hen. And then I think I wanted to show you the monkeys in particular, because I do feel like they really connect to the work that I'm showing in the window downstairs, because I think the octopus installation is very much like the logical extension of that pursuit of gesture, but now adding kind of color and playing more with shaping the environment that I've put them into, I got really interested in the fact that octopuses do modify their colors for their environment, so they try to hide. And then I just kind of started playing with the idea of what that environment could look like that they would need to hide in, which I do think is something I could imagine doing more of. I think that sort of playing back and forth between the creature and the environment is pretty interesting to me. I think the other thing about, I think the octopuses are, they're like even more gestural naturally than the monkeys. And so that got really exciting because they're sort of like free of gravity in a certain way. This is like an earlier iteration of that installation. So at some point, not exactly, this is not really a linear presentation, but at some point I became interested in bringing the work that I was making much more into the center of my life and my family's life. I got really, I guess, tired of the idea that these objects are going to go off into the world and I can't really control where they're going to land. And I also had always been really fascinated by the relationship that people had with the work that I was making, which I think is kind of a natural thing that artists think about, right? Like you want people to connect with the work that you're making. But because I was making work that was animals, I had this like very intimate connection that I could make happen between people and the work. There was sort of this immediacy. And the reason I shifted from the human to the animal, I think, was because I really wanted that immediate connection. People have less of a barrier with animals. And so I started making functional work, but I held on to the animals. And for the first time, I was actually drawing and painting on three-dimensional work, which is a really interesting exploration. So these are some examples of that early work, kind of trying to explore, like, what does it mean to make these functional forms? And I was slab building still because I loved making things out of slabs. They got really playful. I was thinking a lot about like humor and the, what happens if you, what do you put in a spider bowl, and like how people would react to these different creatures that I was presenting them with. They also began to get increasingly like intricately painted. It turns out I discovered I'm seriously a maximalist. I love surface and pattern and possibly excessive decoration. And I wanted to show you also some examples of kind of how I was thinking about the patterns I was using and like the ways these creatures ended up on these forms. So this is a pairing of a Audubon print and my kind of take on this. And part of what I was really drawn to in this print was the fact that he just like jammed that poor flamingo in there, which I thought was just the weirdest way to do it, but at the same time very funny. So there we go. I can't, there's no way I could show, like I'm constantly, as I'm sure you guys are, like I look all the time, right? So there's so many influences, but I do think there are some things that you can kind of see very, like connect directly with my work. So these prints and the kimono are all these kind of layering of pattern right next to each other that I found really interesting. And then sometimes I'll just like take little snippets and repurpose them. So there's another example of that disc shape kind of reappearing. This platter is part of a series of awkward conversations, which actually it turns out has reemerged. This was probably about 10 years ago. I listened to a lot of NPR, like I confess, in my studio, and NPR is full of awkward conversations. Like nobody is talking. You know, there's all these politicians, right? They're on there and they're saying things and nobody is really communicating with anybody very effectively. And so I started thinking about kind of translating this into these animals who are maybe not the best suited for a conversation. I was also really interested in this shallow picture space. I think you probably have seen this like coming through all of this work. I've, for some reason, always loved these spaces that are just kind of not really big enough for the figures. Like, for example, this is an Indian miniature painting from like the 1680s. So here's another example of that, like really shallow picture space, and another awkward conversation. Another place that I have seen that compression of the pattern and the figure is Van Gogh. His portraits and self-portraits. Actually, he does this a ton. Where there's a super active background, and then this figure that's kind of forced up against it, which I can't explain why. I find it fascinating, but I do it over and over again. This is a sort of further exploration of that like depth of, I guess, pictorial space where there's a snake that is definitely causing some danger for that bird. The teapot is a fully functional teapot, just comes off the shelf. You can turn it around. There's another bird that looks even more alarmed on the other side. And then here's a series of assorted animals, although they're actually not really assorted. They're 3 that are very specific. They're like, they require really specific conditions to thrive, and 1 which will thrive anywhere, if you can guess which one that is. So there's an environmental theme kind of appearing in some places. And we've got those guys, so more kind of thinking about that shallow picture space. I wanted to take a moment to talk to you a little bit about the specific installations that are downstairs. So one of them is the bird bowls. And I've been making these nesting bird bowls for a long time, with an increasing kind of emphasis on, for me, on the danger that the population of birds globally is in. And so that piece for me is like very much about how birds are in the world, which is not great. According to a recent survey by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, since 1970, the population of birds in North America has dropped by almost 3 billion. So 3 billion birds gone in that amount of time, in my lifetime. And so this is a graphic that I got from their article, but it's kind of a shocking thing to think about. And there are all kinds of reasons, but one of them is definitely habitat loss. And so the bowls that you see downstairs are a very intentional combination of plants and birds that come from exactly the same place. So this required a lot of research. I spent a huge amount of time thinking about native plants and the birds that are connected with those native plants in all kinds of different environments. And this was some drawings that I did this summer in Maine of the speckled alder and seaweed. And then there's actually a list of all these other plants that I was like, I gotta go look these ones up and think about what they look like. But this was just drawn out in the world. And then I took these drawings that I was making and I turned them into patterns. This is some stencils. And then these are some small bowls in the process of being built. So they start as these kind of fan shapes, and then I turn them into a three-dimensional form. And when they're dry, I paint them with the little bird. And the reason they're on the shelves down there is because I wanted to kind of really directly reference the way that we see birds displayed in natural history museums. And I also just want to say that in looking for an image to kind of illustrate my thought, because the picture I had taken originally was very bad, it's like, oh, the internet will have pictures. Oh my God, there are so many thousands of birds in museums that are dead and stuff like this, so it's slightly horrifying. It was a hard piece to make, actually, because of some of these like harsh realities, but it's also kind of playful, and I think that's, for me, been a really important pairing in all of my work. I really don't want to make work that you recoil from. I actually am really interested in drawing people in and then telling them a story. So the work was very much inspired by reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's Gathering Moss and other books. I'm a huge reader of natural history books, and she writes really beautifully about the direct connection. There's a little quote I wanted you to read about wanted you to hear about the marbled murrelet, which is a coastal bird that feeds on marine life along the Pacific shore. And for decades, people didn't know where their nests were. And all these other coastal birds had started to flourish because of all kinds of protections that people had put into place to save that habitat right along the coast. But the murrelet's population kept dropping. And what Kimmerer points out is that it turned out that the murrelet nesting sites were like 50 miles away in old growth forests. They flew 50 miles every day to feed at the ocean and then to nest in these old growth forests. And their nesting was connected directly to both these old growth forests, these trees, and also the specific moss. So like the intimacy of these relationships, I mean, you could say, okay, my God, like, could you not plan a little bit better, Murrelet? But anyway, it feels really important to think about these things. So the other piece that I wanted to tell you about is the conversations with my father's paintings. So my father died in the last 2 years, and it's been a really difficult thing to move from having this person who is really central to my life as an artist. He was someone I talked with about making art. I made things with him. It was this back and forth. And as he got older, actually, we kind of switched roles because I started to help him to put his shows together where he had helped me when I was younger. And I started to think about the paintings that I live with. This is an example of the one that I was responding to with the cups that are downstairs. And they're in our house, right? They're like, there's my kid having a birthday, and there's his painting right behind it. And I started to sort of ask this question, can these paintings kind of lead me? I was really curious about a really different way of working in functionally, like to step away from that very direct looking at the world and instead kind of think about abstraction. And I kind of started to ask the paintings this question. And it was in part, it was in the beginning, I was going and looking at the painting, and then I was going to my studio. It was like a separate thing, right? And then I painted the painting, like a little painting of the painting, not the whole painting because it's huge. But and then I started to think about like the colors and how do the colors come in, and the lines, and like thinking about what I wanted to be pulling out of the painting and what needed to be, because it's a different material, right? But I'm kind of making these things slowly, kind of pulling this thread of an idea and going from this physical painting to something that's completely different. I didn't know where I was going, but it was a really interesting process to go through to kind of take this as a jumping off place and not be completely literal about it. They really changed a lot in the gallery. They're lined up kind of as I made them, more or less. I can't quite remember, but and so they started to take this the form of the shapes in the painting, instead of being like this is a cup. Like now they're kind of much more abstracted, which I got really excited about. The last thing I was going to tell you about is this totally separate form of art making that I have undertaken for the last decade, which is this Pots on Wheels project. And it is completely impractical. It makes absolutely no sense. So a bunch of potters, we're in a minivan, we're driving to Tennessee to the Utilitarian Clay Symposium. And it was I think there was actually a tornado going on. And we got really excited about the idea of trying to sort of staunch the bleed on the loss of access to education about ceramics. And so we decided what we really needed was a truck that we could drive anywhere, and we could just bring the clay to the people. This was going to be a great idea. It is a great idea. It's really, really hard. It takes a lot of work to make a clay thing happen out of a truck. It's a former Connecticut Power and Light truck that we lovingly restored. We put a wood floor in it. It's a gallery space on the inside, and then on the outside we do these projects. And we've done tons of different kinds of things. We've also started making exhibitions happen as part of this project. We're really focused on trying to both bring ceramics into places that maybe don't even have access to art at all. So that's been a lot of what we've done. And then also to actually think about artists who aren't well represented in the world. So we put on a really amazing exhibition in 2023 in Cincinnati at the Contemporary Art Museum of the work of 19 Black women and non-binary ceramic artists that I don't think that's ever happened before in this country. There have actually started to be some shows by Black women, just Black women, but not before ours. And my co-founder, Adero, is Black, and so we've been thinking a lot about these issues of diversity in the field for years, which is part of why the project started to happen. We have this huge focus on reciprocity. We give. So if you show up to make work with people and it's a one-day thing, they can't really take their thing home with them. They're not going to be able to do anything with it, right? It's going to be this little drying out little thing, right? So we were like, oh my God, we gotta trade. We're going to trade. So we trade. We get artists to give us pots. We make pots. And we also take pots from one thing, take them home, fire them, and take them to the next thing. So we do this exchange. And in the beginning, when we started doing this, we had a lot of pushback from people who were hosting us. They were like, oh, the kids, nobody will like this. In fact, the only person that's ever really actively fought us on this was this police officer in Newport. He was like, I have to take this home. I love this thing so much. I cannot trade. No, I will not trade. So we had to build him a box. But everybody else really loves this trade. This was a really great event we've done a couple times in Portland, Maine, with a refugee resettlement program. We've done, this is Boston, just the Greenway kind of pop-up. So this idea of kind of giving and receiving it's kind of a radical idea, I think. It's really hard to keep it funded. The good thing is that it doesn't cost a lot because the truck is not actually realistic. It's pretty cheap. It's $10,000 a year, we're good. It's pretty much all volunteer, but it's also provided me with a huge amount of community. And the thing that I didn't include in this presentation, because it was already really long, is there's so many artists who work in clay who I've worked with on projects, on aspects of this, whose work becomes, we trade, it becomes part of my life in my home, and then I'm thinking about that as I'm making things. And so I think that this totally separate way of making work, I didn't think of it as an art project in the beginning. I thought of it as like a teaching thing, but I didn't actually realize when we started this that there was a discipline called socially engaged craft. Somebody told me that like 5 years in, and I was like, oh, what a surprise. But it's been a really magical thing to do. So too bad you guys are too far away. We can't bring you the POW truck unless you want to like put it on a train. But it's not a pleasant driving experience. Anyway, that is my full. I think I did it in. I did less than 1 minute per slide, so you'll be happy.